Hello, welcome to my presentation on the importance of large-scale brain network connectivity on quality of life. And my name is Howard Eaton. I'm the director-founder of Eaton Arrowsmith School and the co-founder and chairperson of ABI Wellness. And I'll be discussing the work we're doing within those companies as it relates to large-scale brain network connectivity. Today, over the next 50 or 60 minutes, I'll be covering these topics. One, just an introduction of who I am, what I do, what are large-scale brain networks, some of them that are critical for functioning, the research in this area that we're doing at the Arrowsmith Program, Eaton Arrowsmith School and ABI Wellness, common findings that we're seeing as it relates to large-scale brain network connectivity, not just in the field of learning disabilities, but attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, autism spectrum disorder, and even into the field of brain injury that we're seeing. And also how it's important that we pivot and take a look at what neuroscientists are finding about large-scale brain networks for the field of special education and healthcare, and what it means in terms of assessment, diagnosis, and intervention. And then some of the lifestyle changes that we've heard before and recommended to us: aerobic exercise, quality of life, and diet. But believe it or not, these lifestyle choices impact your connectivity within and between large-scale brain networks. So who is Howard Eaton? Well, this is not me now. This is when I was 11 years old, starting school in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, at a school called the Kildonan School for boys with dyslexia back in 1975. Good Lord, it's like almost 50 years ago. And I was originally diagnosed with dyslexia in 1971-72 by Dr. Carl Klein and his wife in Vancouver. I was not learning to read. I was struggling understanding the code of the language. And fortunately, this psychiatrist who diagnosed me also knew about Orton Gillingham. He had come from Chicago, where the Orton Gillingham method was in use. It wasn't well known in Vancouver in the early 70s, but he brought that awareness to Vancouver, BC, and thus begun my intensive intervention to learn the sound symbol associations of our language. And I spent a good probably 2 years of intensive Orton Gillingham that gave me some word decoding and spelling skills, but I was also becoming severely depressed because it was hard to function in our public school in Vancouver. And because of that, the psychiatrist, Dr. Carl Klein, said that if you can afford it, you should send Howie to one of the best schools for boys with dyslexia. Girls back then weren't as diagnosed, unfortunately. I think the boys had more behavioral issues. But he recommended my parents send me to Kildonan School, which was one of the first schools in the United States that provided intensive language remediation through Orton Gillingham. And so off I went. I spent 2 years there learning further reading and spelling skills, got small classes in science and social studies and English, and developed my confidence and belief in myself that I could actually do school and be successful, and then transitioned back to a junior high school in Edmonton, Alberta. I made it through a lot of perseverance and help with writing essays and support with reading. And the ideas of accommodations and the use of technology really wasn't available back then in Edmonton, Alberta. And it was only when I started trying to get through university that the idea of getting accommodations and using technology like a laptop and a keyboard came into my awareness. This would have been in the 1980s. But given that I had struggled with English, learning a foreign language was difficult, and I had to fight for a language exemption at the University of British Columbia and receive that accommodation eventually and get through university. But what's interesting to note is that the Orton-Gillingham method made a big difference for spelling and reading, but my reading comprehension was still very slow. I had to reread things 3 or 4 times over and develop strategies to try to remember all the information that I was reading. This idea of metacognition was something that I was becoming aware of in my psychology courses. So here's an example how at university, even with the Orton-Gillingham method, I still had these cognitive weaknesses. So my reading speed was slow, my written output was poor, listening to lectures and absorbing information was difficult. So, even with an amazing reading intervention program like Orton-Gillingham, children who are given that intervention, their teenagers still grow into academic challenges because the cognitive weaknesses that are caused by those, that type of experience aren't addressed. So in order to cope, for example, I would have someone else take notes and then recopy those notes when I got home and rewrite them to try to remember them. And I remember one test strategy I had was I would take say it's a sociology textbook that had, I don't know, 8 chapters in it, and it was a year-end exam. I would go to 8 different libraries for each chapter because I learned in psychology that context and memory are associated. So if I studied a chapter in a certain context, that material would be easier to recall. So I'd take chapter 1 and go to the main library and use a pink highlighter and take notes and try to memorize information, and then go to the medical library for chapter 2, the life sciences library for chapter 3, the forestry library for chapter 5, and so on. And in fact, I actually did quite well on that test, but ask me, what that material was afterwards, I would have easily forgotten. So, I sort of lived in this world of tutoring, phonics, accommodations, technology, metacognition, and also self-advocacy, which I did later in my career, where, if you have a learning disability, you have to sort of reframe your learning disability in a positive way, see the gifts that it brings, try to find careers that don't, collide with your weaknesses cognitively, and find careers that match with your strengths. This was my world. And this was all about not improving your weaknesses, but bypassing them, finding ways around them. And it wasn't until after I finished my psychology degree and I was studying for my master's degree at Boston University that I began to come across the idea of the brain and its impact on education. And this was through the work of All Kinds of Minds and their work in neurodevelopment. And essentially it was teaching parents and teachers about the brain, specific functions of the brain, areas of the brain involved in learning, and giving a sense of awareness to teachers and parents of the struggles that someone with a learning disability faces or attention difficulty faces, that this wasn't purposeful lack of effort in learning, but these were real neurodevelopmental issues that students with learning difficulties were facing. And I really got into that work because it was the first, sort of connection between the brain and education. And if you work in academics or academia, these faculties tend to operate in silos and they don't often communicate with each other. I mean, that's improved greatly in the last 10 or 12 years. But when I was doing my master's degree, there wasn't a lot of this blending between neuroscience and education. But the ideas of All Kinds of Minds and neurodevelopment back then was still, once you knew the cognitive weaknesses, you still had to provide, the accommodations, the strategies, the technology, the tutoring to sort of bypass the cognitive weaknesses. And teachers had to teach towards the child's strengths and recognize what those strengths were. And it wasn't until I came across the work of Barbara Arrowsmith Young in neuroplasticity and her Arrowsmith program that all began to shift. And that was back in 2001, 2002, about over 2 decades ago, that I was introduced to her and had coffee with her in downtown Vancouver. And, I was somewhat skeptical of this work, but I was an open-minded person. But I was skeptical because, I had lived my whole personal life and then my professional life around this idea that cognitive weaknesses were permanent, that you were born with what you were given by your parents or your grandparents or great grandparents, and you had to work around these cognitive weaknesses to find success and reframe yourself to feel proud of your strengths that you have, and sort of forget about those weaknesses in your life and don't let them bring you down. But Barbara Arrowsmith Young had a very different approach, in that you could actually change these capacities or these cognitive functions and improve the brain's ability to analyze this information more efficiently that was coming from your environment, whether listening or writing and taking down information or working through conversations that people were having with you. So it was quite a shift in what I was hearing, but I was curious and always have been curious. And so I listened and was very intrigued, and decided to go visit her school after about 3 or 4 of my parents that I was doing psychoeducational assessments on their children had actually moved to Toronto and had come back, and we updated their assessments, and we saw remarkable changes, improvements in processing speed, working memory, reasoning capacity. It was just types of cognitive changes and measures of intelligence that I had never seen before, or cognitive functioning. So with that, I said, okay, I have to visit her school in Toronto and see what she's doing, and was just very impressed, and said, okay, I have to bring this work to Vancouver, which I have done over the last 20 years. So that's my background and my interest, both personal and professional. The concept of neuroplasticity is central to all of this, and this is a concept that is no longer debated in science. It is a proven fact that the brain has this ability to change both its physical structure and its functional organization to form these new neural connections throughout our life, which is wonderful news. But how it relates to learning disabilities, attention disorders, autism spectrum disorder, brain injury is what's really important. Of course, as we age as well, the aging brain, can we improve these structures and functions in our brain? And the answer is yes. There's a whole sorts of neuroscience research that's advocating that this is the case. Of course, there are great programs, and there are programs that may not be as effective. But the program I've been involved with is the Arrowsmith Program, which I think is one of the most intensive and thorough cognitive intervention programs that build capacity in the whole world. And neuroplasticity, you can see it when you learn new skills like juggling, for example. You're building pathways in the brain if you're new to that concept. There was a study of London taxi drivers who were studying for their test that the more they practiced the visual spatial activities, the stronger those areas of the brain became neurologically, and more efficient they were at locating addresses and places they had to drive to. So neuroplasticity is something that is widely accepted. What are these large-scale brain networks? This is an interesting image. It looks like there's a whole bunch of chopsticks in this image of her brain, but these blue dots are nodes, and those look like chopsticks, or the connections between these nodes. So this is an image, illustration of the human brain with the front and back and the side. And what this is showing is there's a complex array of connections that go from one area of the brain, one region of the brain, to another, and provide our capability of doing very complex things, like reasoning through scientific problems, understanding astrophysics, reading complex literature, following movies that have complex themes. Our ability of the brain to connect to these different regions allow us to engage in these challenging cognitive and affective challenges in our life. There are roughly, there's quite a few networks, but there are 4 or 6 that a lot of scientists pay a lot of attention to. We're going to cover 4 of these major networks in this discussion. And again, the neuroscientists are really discovering just how important this architecture is in our overall quality of life, as you'll see. I love this image using diffusion tensor imaging. And these are white matter tracks. Using this technology, they're able to look at some of the structural connectivity within the human brain. So you can see this human's brain is sort of cut in half in this imaging, and on top of it is the sort of inside of the brain and the connections, the white matter tracks that exist, and how different regions of the brain use these tracks to communicate to each other. It's quite incredible. You can see also why someone who's had a traumatic brain injury and some of these networks are shredded, struggle trying to return to work. They have all sorts of cognitive difficulties. They have brain fog. They have planning and organization difficulties if there's some structural issues connecting to their prefrontal lobe. And these are, delicate structures, so you don't want to have a traumatic brain injury. You want your kid to wear a helmet, but even with helmets, that can be dangerous. So I often wish teachers or people who are teaching, educators, could see into the human brain, that the brain was somewhat transparent, the skull was transparent, you can see all this happening. I think we'd be in awe of what the challenge is for teachers to educate children. These are the 4 networks that, again, that we were at Arrowsmith Program and ABI Wellness has paid a lot of attention to. These are sort of 4 major networks that exist: the default mode, the dorsal attention, salience and frontoparietal or executive control network. And I love this slide, and we'll come back to it again, but I love how it was put together. It was put together by Dr. Greg Rose from Southern Illinois University and his colleagues. But essentially, the default mode network sort of gets you going into that I'm thinking about this information. It's sort of here I am. I'm aware that I am in the process of analyzing and thinking. And the dorsal attention sort of says to, it's sort of responsible for what's going on here, what's happening in this situation. And the salience is sort of determining what's important to know, what are critical pieces of information. And then the frontal parietal or executive control is, how should I respond to this information? And so this is all sort of happening quickly, rapidly, as you're presented with some sort of challenging academic task or a new social situation. Of course, the networks can falter and you can struggle with what's important to know or what's going on here. You may not even be present, so you're not even thinking. You're drifting off into not a land, and there's no chance to get to the other networks because you're not even present. And then others sort of get to the point where they know what's important, but they don't know how to execute the activity and how to respond to it. So it's an interesting way to look at the world of the learner. And of course, the question is, are these networks different for students with learning disabilities or attention disorders or autism spectrum disorder than they are with students without these issues? So we're going to be delving into those 4 networks. So a bit about what the Arrowsmith program is. Again, the premise of the program, and again, apologies to anyone who's familiar with it, but those who aren't, is that it's the change the brain, change the capacity to learn program. So it's not about changing the curriculum. It's not about making learning easier. It's about, in terms of presenting curriculum, it's about looking at the human brain, determining what regions and networks might be weak, and then targeting those cognitive difficulties with cognitive exercises that actually alter the capacity of the brain by modifying these networks over time. And that was the premise a long time ago, before Barbara Arrowsmith Young had any neuroscience imaging technology. Of course, she faced a lot of criticism early from educators who weren't knowledgeable about the human brain, but were so embedded in their ideas of curriculum and strategies and accommodations, and the sort of feeling through their training the brain was fixed, that her insight into this was something that they were not going to pay attention to. And if they did hear about it, they'd just be critical. But of course, now with this imaging technology, her theory and concepts are proven accurate. And it's very exciting to see that development. So the outcomes of using the Arrowsmith program is you don't need to modify the curriculum. So, if you go to schools for learning disabilities that aren't about capacity changing or improving these cognitive functions, what they'll do is they'll reduce the curriculum load, create small classes, put metacognition and strategies in place, provide accommodations and technologies, focus on the students' strengths, advise them to avoid careers that challenge their weakness. And this still goes on today. It is frustrating for me because I know that doesn't need to be the case. But parents are still choosing that type of intervention over capacity changing. And I think sometimes the feeling is that if you have to do a capacity changing program like Arrowsmith, your child is more severe than someone who doesn't go to that type of program. And that's just not the case. I think everyone can benefit from capacity changing. You can always improve functionality in your life. And I think it should be the first line of intervention for all cases of learning disabilities, attention disorders, autism spectrum disorder. The recommendation should be first, let's change capacity, because that alters all sort of life outcomes that you can focus on. Again, the idea is targeted cognitive programs through differential stimulation and effortful processing. So it's a really important concepts in neuroplasticity, that the stimulation has to be specific. It has to go to a baseline and then become a bit more challenging over time. And there has to be a significant amount of effort to get these brain regions and networks connected and active and begin to alter the structure of the human brain. There are actually slides now of neurons being stimulated, and you can actually see the growth of the neuron through the stimulation, not of humans, but of animal cells. It's quite remarkable. So it leads to these structural brain changes the capacity of the learner and ability to learn. You get increased social emotional well-being, and of course, increased academic success by doing that. This has all been researched. It's all been shown. You can go to the arrowsmithprogram.ca/research website and get a real look at the significant amount of research that the Arrowsmith program has undergone. Again, to reiterate, the learner can be modified, capacity can be developed over time. You can strengthen these cognitive functions, these neural networks. This is some of the research universities and schools that have been involved. I've been early involved with the University of British Columbia and Southern Illinois University. The Toronto Catholic School Board did research. University in Spain, a school in Australia, another one in Alberta. So quite a lot of research, a lot of students, a lot of studies. Very exciting. In terms of large-scale brain network connectivity, these two researchers were very much involved. Dr. Lara Boyd at the University of British Columbia at her Brain Behavior Lab, and Dr. Greg Rose at Southern Illinois University are the two that I'll be referring to quite a bit. And this is the Arrowsmith Program exercise that was studied as it relates to large-scale brain networks. This is the symbol relations exercise. This is a young girl doing the symbol relations exercise. It, if it looks familiar to you, it looks like an analog clock. And right here, the child is reading a one-handed clock and trying to get accuracy in it. And there's a lot of information to understand conceptually in this symbol relations exercise. It's quite a remarkable exercise on its own. And it can get to 2 3-handed clocks to 10-handed clocks. So like a 3-handed clock would be seconds, minutes, and hours. The children, progress through this over sometimes an intensive summer program. Some can be doing this for 2 years intensively to improve this capacity. So what does this exercise do? Symbol relations as a cognitive function works on the brain region and networks of regions responsible for grasping relationships, understanding cause and effect, reasoning the why of things or why of events, being able to make decisions, comparing and weighing alternatives, comprehending what you're reading and what you've heard, mathematical reasoning, understanding logic, having those insights, so aha moments. If any of you have a child with these difficulties, or you're a professional and you know people with learning disabilities or attention deficit disorder that have these problems, it's quite common in the field of learning disabilities. It's a form of reasoning and intelligence, and it's quite remarkable what one cognitive exercise could do to change your child's capacity to do these kinds of things. I remember, just a side note, that when I was doing psychoeducational assessments and we came across a child who had trouble reading a wristwatch or an analog clock, my solution right away, which was what I was trained to do in my graduate days, was to say, hey, they're digital clocks. You could get a digital wristwatch, you can get a digital table clock, and the child doesn't have to worry about understanding an analog clock. And oh my God, I wish I could go back to those 2,000 families and tell them what a mistake I was making, because it was the first sign as a clinician that I would have had that conceptual or cause and effect reasoning was going to be a serious problem for them, because it would move not only analog clock, you had trouble reading it in class if you're trying to tell time, but you're going to struggle with other things like reading comprehension, math problem solving, social reasoning, huge complications for that child later in life. So, with symbol relations, that was the exercise being used to look at the 4 major brain networks and analyze them. This is, again, research from Southern Illinois University. Again, you'll see those 4 networks. And the researchers wanted to know if you took a typical learner without learning disabilities and compared it to a child with learning disabilities, was there differences in these large-scale brain networks? And most importantly, after an intensive intervention using symbol relations, part of the Arrowsmith program, can these large-scale brain networks improve? Can you alter them? So again, these are the 4 things that they were looking at. So these students would actually go into a functional MRI machine doing clocks. They were actually able to set up a clocks program within a functional MRI machine. So students were actually telling time essentially live as their brain was being imaged, and they could actually look at these networks and their connectivity live as they were engaged. Again, this is the default dorsal attention salience frontoparietal networks. So when they looked at students without learning disabilities, they were able to look within the network structure and then between networks. And I know this gets complex in the neuroscience of it, but I essentially just want you to get the big picture of how important these four networks are, that they are able to look at each of these networks and the connectivity within that network, and then look at their relationship to the other network. So when you do an analog clock and a child has to tell time, or all these networks are working together to help you complete that task. But they also work in isolation. So there could be a breakdown in one network that leads to a breakdown in the whole task of telling time with an analog clock. And so they were looking at this, and this was sort of the pattern they saw of students without learning disabilities. And when they looked at students with learning disabilities and network connectivity, they began to see differences in the structure of these connections, with some connections being weaker, some connections being stronger. And that was, a finding that was very important. And one of the first sort of studies that began to look at the field of learning disabilities and these large-scale brain networks. And what was interesting is that the research has been going on not just with the Arrowsmith Program at Southern Illinois University and University of BC, but other locations as well. Like Cambridge University published a study in February 2020, just 3 years ago, roughly, in the journal Current Biology. And they had the same outcome. They said the same thing, that learning difficulties seem to be due to poor connectivity of these large-scale brain networks, sort of supporting the Southern Illinois University research that was going on. And they looked at 337 students with related cognitive problems. And these students had poorly connected the hubs within these networks, and then very few poor connections, leading to significant cognitive issues. And it suggests that when we look at intervention and diagnosis, we need to start looking at these large-scale brain networks and cognitive difficulties to have a better understanding of the severity of the problems these students face. After 10 months of the Arrowsmith program, it was really remarkable to see that these students had reduced network hyperconnectivity. So, what we were seeing is that as a child was trying to read analog clock, they had a lot of activity going on. There was a lot of cognitive load, a lot of trying to figure out what the answer is, what's important to know, how do I respond to this analog clock to give the answer for the time. So, one can see how exhausting learning is. If these connections are hyper connected, it doesn't take long for this brain to lose power, to lose energy, and get fatigued. And that's what we see with learning disabilities, of what we call a cognitive load, that they're in class, they're trying to listen to the teacher, absorb what's being said just auditorily, deciphering the vocabulary, trying to reason through this information, possibly having to take notes as they're trying to get this information down. And these large-scale brain networks are just overloaded and hyper-connected, and there's no efficiency, and they get easily overwhelmed and lose focus and lose attention. So they were able to reduce the hyperconnectivity, and then in areas that were underconnected before training, they were able to increase that connectivity. So areas of large-scale brain network connectivity that were not utilized as effectively began to show stronger connections over time, which is, again, another finding. So you can reduce hyperconnectivity and increase underconnectivity to try to normalize overall connectivity as compared to a child without a learning disability. And what was interesting too, is these changes that occurred related to their advancement in the symbol relations exercise. So if they were able to go from one hands to two hand clocks to three hand clocks to four hand clocks over a period of time, the brain connectivity showed stronger, what we would call sort of typical functioning over time. And so the more advanced you were in the exercise, the more you were showing sort of a typical child's brain that did not have a learning disability. And the stronger sites, the most significant areas of improvement were within and between the saliency network, which is what's important to know, and the default mode, which is, I'm thinking, I'm focused. And so this sort of attention focus, trying to figure out the important information, are the networks that seem to show or did show the greatest strength. So imagine how this cross correlates to, reading comprehension or math problem solving. So here that was one of the things I had to grasp when I first was introduced to Arrowsmith, is that how could learning an analog clock in multiple hands translate to academic success with reading comprehension or math problem solving skills or listening to science lectures. And it's because all those areas require ability to figure out what's important to know and to improve your capacity to know that you can sustain, focus on this material. And if those networks responsible for those activities across a broad spectrum of cognitive tasks and challenges is improved, it improves, all these academic activities, not just being able to read an analog clock. And that's what's, really exciting to see, is that you get this, transition of ability into academic challenges, even if you're just working on this symbol relations training activity. So overall, the researchers were stating at UBC there seems to be a story here about cognitive efficiency, which includes working memory, attention, learning, and the capacity to learn new things. These are really important cognitive skills for success at school and life in general. And this is, when I go back 20 years ago, this is what I was seeing when I was testing kids in 2004, 2003, who were coming through the Arrowsmith program. I think I mentioned I saw improved working memory, processing speed, attention. And this is what the researchers at UBC were also saying. At the University of Calgary, where they did an analysis, they said strengthening cognitive functions presumed to underlie academic achievement deficits improves reading, math, and writing by targeting the cause, the deficit, rather than the symptoms. And then Greg Rose and his group at Southern Illinois University said, there is neuroplasticity as a function of Arrowsmith training, which generally improves performance. Do precise cognitive exercise activate and functionally change particular areas or networks of the brain? The answer is yes. So these are all researchers outside of the Arrowsmith program who saw what essentially I saw, in psych ed assessments, but they were seeing it in brain imaging technology. The ABI Wellness is a business I started with the green light of Barbara Arrowsmith Young, my colleague Mark Watson, who was the principal of Eton Arrowsmith School, Vancouver. And I asked Barbara, can we take your work into healthcare and into brain injury cognitive intervention? And we actually had students from a facility in Vancouver called GF Strong. These are teenagers that were in like a pedestrian hit by a car, walking across the street, or a car accident, and they had brain injury. The parents had phoned us at Eton Arrowsmith School and said, I know you deal with learning disabilities, but is there a chance you might take on my child, with a brain injury? And so I called Barbara and asked her what she thought. She said, yes, she's had some cases who responded well with the Arrowsmith program, but, to let the parents know the program's, was focused more in learning disabilities, at least the research side of things. So she said, give it a shot. You've learned about brain injury. You've seen some of the cases of kids with brain injury who come through your school. And in fact, I'm sure there are kids who've had brain injuries who are diagnosed with learning disability, but the primary cause may be a brain injury. You're not supposed to be diagnosed with a learning disability if you've had a brain injury, but some head impacts are really not known by parents. So it could have been a sporting incident, a fall. You think it's just a knock on the head, but you never know. Sometimes the causation could have been a brain injury. And so, there are cases where that has occurred. For example, I worked at Bosch University in the disability office with Dr. Lauren Brinkerhoff, and one day a journalist student came to see me, a woman, and she was struggling in her journalism program with reading comprehension. And she started talking to me about her struggles in school ever since she was 12. And I said, was there anything that happened when you were 12 years old? And she said, yeah, I was biking along and I was hit by a truck. And I said, what? And she said, yeah, my grades were really bad since then. And I said, listen, we're going to send you to get some brain imaging. She got the brain imaging done, and there was a section of her brain that was inactive. Her actual cause of her learning difficulties was a brain injury. But she initially came into the disability office at Boston University as someone with a learning disability. But anyway, so we said to Barbara, okay, we're going to start ABI Wellness, and we're going to take your work into healthcare and see if we can make a difference. We added aerobic exercise to it, mindfulness practice, and quality of life tracking. And the results have been, pretty amazing. And the reason is you'll see that we're addressing these large-scale brain networks that get dysfunctional after a brain injury. And this is one case which was remarkable. Amanda, who came into ABI Wellness, she had a drug overdose and was actually lying on her mom's kitchen floor when her mom walked in, and she was blue, and her mom revived her, and the ambulance came, and she had been anoxic for some time. That means she wasn't breathing in oxygen. And the result of this anoxia due to a drug overdose was a real lack of self-awareness, a difficulty with spoken language, sort of brain fog, mental slowness, inability to focus, and fatigue. And she worked on symbol programs like Symbol Relations for 7 months in our half-day program. And she saw such remarkable changes in that all these symptoms began to improve. And she says here in her quote, if I hadn't come here, I won't be able to speak like I am now, that's for sure. So she regained speech, very fluent speech. She was able to plan and organize and execute on tasks because these large-scale brain networks were coming back online. She was able to take care of herself in ways that she wasn't able to before. And now we have, hundreds of these cases, in brain injury. And so this program at ABI, we call it the BEARS platform. We look at cognitive rehab through we call it the, Brain X program, but Arrowsmith program. We've added aerobic exercise, as you'll see in a moment, so important for large-scale brain network connectivity, mindfulness practice, and we track their quality of life, so holistic health. And the initial research we did on it for brain injury was also done at UBC, and we studied a group of clients who had traumatic brain injury for 3 months. And we saw significant changes in brain function connectivity. Again, like we saw with, at the Southern Illinois University and UBC with learning disabilities. And one of the most improved areas was fluid intelligence or logical reasoning or problem solving. The big impact, I think, there was the Symbol Relations program. And again, also in the area of executive functioning, which is planning, organizing. And we had a return to work rate that was double what was seen in the usual population, which wasn't the case. So, what's interesting in brain injury, just like in learning disabilities or special ed, the ideas were strategies, accommodations, and technology, because the idea was that you can't change capacity. And so we're changing capacity, Barbara Arrowsmith Young's work, changing capacity in a wide variety of populations, which just proves the essence of her work. And this again is a sign too. We just track people using quality of life tracking. And, we look at all different rehab areas, but this is, at that time, 47 clients. Average age of the client with the brain injury was 44, sort of males 20, females 27, TBI, acquired brain injury, a traumatic brain injury. And, we saw improvements in all areas, but one of the largest areas was, processing speed, attention, concentration, and cognitive flexibility. Again, I go back to, years when I was just doing psych ed assessments. These are the changes I saw. So it was nice to see researchers, third-party researchers, saying the same thing. And, what's really interesting here, this is, I know, pretty dense research, but you can get the slides here afterwards. But, they're actually looking at infants and dyslexia, and is there a predictive nature? If we look at infants and early structural or early neural functional connectivity, can we determine that this child's going to be struggling with learning later in life? And not just with dyslexia, as the first study was done in 2022 with infants, but also with ADHD. Is there, genetic traits here? Can we identify early on sort of individuals that may have a significant heritable trait of poor functional connectivity that could lead to difficulties later in life? And again, you'll see here with autism, the last one, autism spectrum disorder, again, evidence that large-scale brain network connectivity is a problem for that population also. So, just imagine that across these multiple fields, that the similar problem is showing up, and as well with things like traumatic brain injury. And one of the only programs I know of that actually addresses this is the Arrowsmith Program. And there are parents and professionals who continue to refer families to schools that don't address this, and sort of just accepting that dysfunctional or atypical large-scale brain network connectivity is normal, and it just isn't. What else can we do? Certainly, I've mentioned it at the beginning. Aerobic exercise has a very positive impact on improving large-scale brain network connectivity. Aerobic exercise also improves the biological development of neurogenesis, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, which helps with plasticity. That's why it's important. One could actually really highly recommend aerobic exercise before learning new activities, because your brain is sort of primed for improved brain change if you do so. And then, of course, sleep. We all know as adolescents, if you have a teenager losing sleep, their schoolwork goes down the drain. Or if you're an adult and you're not getting a lot of deep sleep, what's being affected again is your large-scale brain networks and their connectivity, and you begin to have sleep deprivation and wake up with brain fog, and you sort of have days of uncertainty. So sleep, aerobic exercise, and diet. And here they talk about the Mediterranean diet, which we've all heard, and its impact on benefiting the large-scale brain networks of the human brain. So I just wanted to bring those in as additional insights into how researchers are not just looking at learning disabilities, autism spectrum disorder, brain injury, aging brain. It's just an area of neuroscience that's just exploding with research. So I hope that gave you an insight into large-scale brain network connectivity, how the Arrowsmith Program's research is showing that it is directly improving large-scale brain network connectivity, and this is why we're getting some really fabulous results and outcomes from our students. who are no longer needing accommodations or using strategies to get through in life. They're able to find careers that they never thought they could have before. How we've moved this work into brain injury. And we're seeing the same impact on those who've had traumatic brain injuries or acquired brain injuries. We're getting higher return to work rates, which is very exciting. Josh Poirier is going to be with you here to answer questions. If you have any questions for me, please email them at heaton@eatonarrowsmith.com. So thanks for listening. Have a great day.